Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here this morning and to share and make some contribution to the thinking and reflection on an important occasion. I share some of the thoughts that have already been expressed this morning about a great collective sigh of relief probably last year that 2016 was over. But then where now and what next? What I want to try and address this morning is beyond 2016, where now for commemorations in a changing world. The Rising and the Somme were, of course, definitive events providing respective foundational myths for both parts of Ireland, but it doesn't mean that we're through with commemorations or that we should be. There are still significant events from 1912 to 1922 or 23 to be commemorated or marked, and from that significant lessons are to be learned. I want to suggest that there are three thematic clusters of events and to suggest that maybe our way forward in the next part of the decade is to focus not just on remembering a future, but on, and I'll say more about that, but more on themes or a thematic cluster. One is the violence of the past. The second half of the decade, I think, was more bloody and violent than the first half, though the early part of the decade had put the gun firmly back in Irish politics. God and guns was a familiar unionist and nationalist theme by 1916. So a critical perspective, I think, is required on the violence of the past and its legacy if violence is to be rejected as a way to achieve or to defend political and cultural goals. We still have to find, I think, and commit to an alternative and actively non-violent way to deal with differences. And that means a critical and non-judgmental way of dealing with the past. Now, between 1919 and 1923, we have to deal with and process the War of Independence, 1919-1921, the Civil War, 1922-23, and the Belfast killings, as well as Lisburn and Dromore in 1921-1922. Now, we will probably argue over what to call some of these events: War of Independence or Anglo-Irish War, or even a civil war between Irishmen of the IRA and the RIC. Were the Belfast killings of majority Catholic people a pogrom or not? The Civil War still deeply divides families and relatives, still not able to talk about it. But as President Michael D. Higgins said at Béal-na-Bláth last year on the commemoration of Michael Collins in West Cork, no side had the monopoly of violence or virtues. So a kind of narrative hospitality is required to enable the diverse narratives to be heard and the generosity, perhaps, to let go of generational hurt. A second theme is democratic foundations. However imperfect, the foundations of parliamentary governance and democracy were laid between 1919 and 1921. In 2019, we reached the centenary of the founding of Dáil Éireann. It struggled, but by 1922 there was an Assembly of Ireland that survived and is still the democratic parliament of the Republic of Ireland. In 1921, the Northern Ireland Parliament came into being and began its experiment with democracy. Both parliaments on this island were born in and from violence. For the next decades, both embodied more or less one-party rule, Northern Ireland somewhat more than the Free State, as it was known. Neither made for healthy politics. Both states were confessional, a Protestant state and a Catholic state, and only in more recent years has the unhealthy confessionalism begun to collapse. We have lived through the death of Christendom in its Irish versions. All of this has to be, I think, critically acknowledged as we mark the foundations of the respective parliaments. From the decade until now, it has been a struggle, including a violent struggle, for both parts of Ireland. Northern Ireland remains a very contested society, a contestedness that has been thrown into sharp focus again by Brexit, with very different questions from the one that our ancestors thought they were answering 100 years ago. Perhaps the thinking of then will not do now, and much of our traditional political ideologies may well be obsolete in this part of the 21st century. Commemorating democratic foundations will call for critical and imaginative thinking about how we can strengthen democracy, build on it, adapt it for the present era. Democracy is never a finished product, never static, can never be taken for granted, and requires ongoing reinvention, recreating, and deepening. Commemoration is about remembering the future, which means we will be asking again questions about the nature, the components, and the shape of democracy in 2030. Third theme is the common good. This is not just a present and future theme for Ireland, North and South, it is a European common good. And in a more than ever globalised world, we are talking about and trying to imagine a planetary common good. This is a common good that embraces social, political, cultural, human and environmental life. It may not be enough any longer to be simply Irish, British, American, Brazilian, Chinese or whatever. We need perhaps to nurture a sense of global citizenship, that we belong to a global human and bio family, that we are interdependent as never before, that we need global values that will enable human and environmental flourishing, that we need new economic models beyond socialism and capitalism. Some countries perhaps are now realising that more is needed than gross national product and free markets, that there is a greater need for what some are describing as gross national happiness, human and environmental well-being. We need perhaps an alternative social order rooted in the values of social, distributive and restorative justice and active compassion, that social solidarity that binds us together in suffering and potential and opportunity and a greater sense of equality. Can we somehow see ourselves as a human family bound together in some kind of neighbourliness or neighbourly covenant? I want to turn now to the larger commemorations of 1917, 1922. And part of the approach that I think we've had in the first part of the decade has been to try and see things in a much wider and more global context. There were other things going on in the world, and there were things that were impinging and washing over the shore of Ireland at that time as well, from elsewhere. Now, this year sees a centenary of the Russian Revolution. 100 years ago, in fact, yesterday, was the centenary of the February Revolution. It was part of the great disaster and catastrophe of World War I. It was the moment when revolutionary Russia sued for peace with Germany and left the French and the British to the rest of the war with the three Central Powers. Now, I think the Russian Revolution cannot be ignored this year. There is, of course, the October Revolution as well. There was an awareness of Ireland in Russia at the time and an awareness of what was going on there in Ireland as well. It was the only empire involved in the war that had a revolution, and only in Russia did the revolution set about a root and branch transformation of economic and political systems and structures, and it was only in Russia that the ruling class was completely destroyed. The Russian Empire collapsed, the Tsar and his family were removed from power and later murdered in Ekaterinburg. The latter has produced a crisis of legitimacy. What followed that revolution in February and in October was a tyranny almost worse, with a long reach into the last quarter of the 20th century. Now, there is much to recall and reflect on in this revolution. There are huge social questions. There are labour issues. There are issues of equality and social justice. There is the role of women, very much so, in social change. And they were the people who were responsible for what happened in February, 100 years ago yesterday. When that revolution began 100 years ago yesterday, the Tsar was impregnable, it seemed. By 100 years next Thursday, the Tsar had abdicated and gone. And women, I think, were largely responsible for that kind of social revolution and change. But there is also the question, and ethical remembering will ask critically, what kind of society any form of autocracy creates, and why violent revolution often replaces an oppressive, unjust system, sometimes with the same or much worse. We still need to robustly critique state violence wherever it occurs, and the violence of resistance to or overthrow of the state, and in 2017 we can engage with that moral maze, and I suggest that that is a moral maze. In 2018 there will be events to commemorate the end of the catastrophic World War I. It will not be a commemoration of victory, but will require to be as sensitive as I think the commemorations of 1914 and 1916 have been. Again, a more inclusive and mature commemoration will be needed. There will be no room for celebration. 16 million died, and many more were left maimed and wounded, many scarred physically and psychologically for the rest of their lives. A century of distance from this terrible war has given us, I think, a more critical and nuanced perspective. There was unprecedented slaughter and indescribable valour, terrible and unimaginable hell, and amazing acts of heroism and humanity. And all of this should be recognised. But our commemoration should be tempered by the reality that the war did not end in 1918. Trench hostility ceased, surrenders were signed, but only Britain, France and the USA claimed any kind of victory. But victory for whom? Closer attention to history shows that for millions of Europeans, the war did not end in 1918. There was the total collapse of three empires, but from 1917 to 1923, there was an ongoing nightmarish series of conflicts that engulfed country after country. What followed were revolutions, pogroms, mass expulsions, and major military confrontations. What happened in Russia in 1917 was perhaps a starting point for cataclysmic events that claimed millions of more lives in Europe between 1917 and 1923. So by all means, let's mark the end of the war in 1918, but I suggest we need to put end in quotes, because vengeance, retribution and revolution convulsed many parts of Europe. And what happened in Ireland in that period was in a somewhat minor key. Fascism and communism prevented democratization of Europe, and 20 years later, the war continued on an even greater catastrophic scale, this time claiming 66 million lives, 44 million of whom were civilians. In the first half of the 20th century, Europe went to hell and back. But the miracle of transformation and peace that emerged, however imperfectly, in 1949 with the creation of the forerunner of the European Union is another story. And I would suggest it's a story the fruit of which, in terms of peace, we have enjoyed for over 60 years. But that European peace is threatened again by one of the same forces that brought the world to war in 1914, a rise which became an explosion of ethnic racist nationalism. Another was the crisis of capitalism, and these two threaten the very peace of Europe and the world again. So in 2018, we need to commemorate with critical awareness and steep learning from the past, as well as greater ethical commitment to justice and to peace. One event to which I think we need to pay particular attention is the centenary of the Paris Peace Conference in 2019. It is a highly significant event, without which we cannot understand some of the happenings in our world today. The so-called victorious powers met in Paris in 1919 to try and reconstruct a world order out of the catastrophe of World War I. Europe had almost destroyed itself. Indeed, it was the end of European imperialism. 4 of the 6 empires had collapsed, and the remaining French and British empires had only another 3 or 4 decades of fading life left before they too collapsed and joined the wreckage of history. The collapse of politics required a new political order to be created, And the French, British and Americans mainly had, let's admit, a thankless task. They did, though, try to reshape the world in their own image. The map of Europe was redrawn, 17 new republics were created, regions were partitioned and repartitioned, and the League of Nations was founded with responsibility for good governance and peace between the nations. The League was maimed from the start. The Russians were excluded from the conference and from the League, and the Americans refused to be part of it, even though President Wilson was an enthusiastic supporter. The Treaty of Versailles humiliated the Germans and created the conditions for a political messiah called Hitler to come to power in the 1930s. Paris may have redrawn the map of Europe, but it left up to 30 million people displaced and wandering around as ethnic minorities belonging nowhere. Of most far-reaching significance was the giving of mandates to the French and British for the former provinces of the collapsed Ottoman Empire, which were in the Middle East. Now, mandates were to be a form of governance of these provinces under the direction of the League of Nations. But the French and the British, in their imperial arrogance, ignored the League and carved up the Middle East in their own self-interest. They drew lines in the sand, imposed borders, and created very artificial new countries such as Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, and played totally dishonest games with Palestine. They created volatility. The rest is tragic history. These are the countries from which Europe's current problem of migration arises. The humanitarian crisis, and Syria, which still has the potential to be a spark which might ignite a third global conflict. We need, in the midst of our local commemorations, to give very serious and critical attention to the centenary of the Paris Peace Conference in 2019. Its decisions and legacies still threaten the peace not only of the Middle East, but of the world. Let me end by asking, well, where now with commemorations in a changing world? The memory work and commemoration of the second half of the decade has courageous and creative and ethical work to do. It is work we need to do in an unsettling and changing world. Democracy, human rights and pluralism are all under threat. Political populism is on the rise, which appears to be anti-democratic, anti-pluralist, racist, xenophobic, and about the rise again of aggressive nationalism. Commemoration of events in Ireland 2012 to 2016 took place in a world which has now changed. In 2016, 3 major events happened which have changed the context for commemoration, I suggest, between 2017 and 2022. We've had the referendum on Brexit, and we still have no idea where that is going to lead or what it will mean. We've had the American presidential election with its world of alternative facts, post-truth, fake news, and the press and media, the enemy of the people. Familiar words of Stalin and Mao. We've had the collapse of the Northern Ireland Assembly and the possibility that after the 2nd of March it may not resume or exist again anytime soon. Now, if commemoration is nearly always shaped by the present rather than the past, the second half of the decade will be a very different present from 2012 to 2016. But let's take some hope. How things were handled between 2012 and 2016 might give us the confidence to take on 2017 to 2022 and do things well. We take note, though, that the centenaries of the Civil War and the founding of Northern Ireland will be more difficult and sensitive than much that has gone before. And we may be tempted to want to forget, and what we may want to forget may be of more significance. Remembering the future may be of more significance and be more important. There are and there will be more challenges to where we may want to be and have to be in 2020 and certainly by 2030. What in local and global terms will the common good look like? We could avoid that challenge by becoming lost in commemoration of a past or a selected part of the past. And focus on the past in an obsessive way could become a way of avoiding the present and the future. And we need, I think, to resist that. In our memory and commemorative work, as we remember the past and remember the future, we will have to think very deeply, I suggest, about the 20th century. We have too quickly forgotten the 20th century. The late Tony Judd argued that we have entered upon an age of forgetting. Whereas Europeans, we have set aside our immediate past even before we could make sense of it. With the rise now of ethno-nationalism in Europe, Brexit, the rise of far-right politics, the closing of borders and building of walls, there seems to have been a loss of memory. It's only just over 25 years since the Berlin Wall came down, since the liberation of much of Eastern and Central Europe. How soon have we forgotten? Dealing with the past and commemoration is about making sense of the past. But we have set aside much of the 20th century past before we could really make sense of it. As Judd points out, quote, for most of continental Europe and much of Asia, the 20th century, at least until the 1970s, was a time of virtually unbroken war, colonial war, civil war. War in the last century signified occupation, displacement, deprivation, destruction, and mass murder. So the 20th century was an orgy of violence and repression. Much was destroyed and lost. Yet perhaps we have quickly forgotten and have not thought deeply enough about the century that it seems we would rather forget. At the heart of Brexit is the free market and the economy. With other parts of the world, we think now exclusively in economic terms, prosperity, growth, GDP, efficiency, output, interest rates, and stock market performances. Democracy is being dumbed down, human rights rubbished, and there is a chasm that has opened up between truth and trust. Everything is reduced to tweets, sound bites, slogans, and we seem to have little place for robust and sustained intellectual thought, which is critical thought. It seems that in some places, if you utter an intellectual thought today, you are dismissed as belonging to the elite, and the elite are to be removed from what's being described as the real people and the real thought of the world of tweet and the world of sloganeering. Functioning democracies must cease or adjust to the politics of frustration or populist resentment. Intellectual free thinking, perhaps not allowed. Fear is now the pervasive and active ingredient of public life, so we have a politics of fear. In Judd's words, fear of foreigners, fear of change, fear of open frontiers and open communications, fear of the free exchange of unwelcome opinions. We can expect, and he wrote this in 2009, before his death, we can expect more along these lines in years to come, probably aimed at restricting the flow of threatening goods and ideas, as well as people. The politics of insecurity, he said, are contagious. Well, we have forgotten too quickly the horror and catastrophe of the 20th century, where we have come from, what we emerged from, the struggle, and it was a struggle for peace and justice and human rights and freedom. The Irish decade 1912-1922 is only a small part of the 20th century and a part player in it. But we repeated our particular horror and violence in the last third, one of the last parts of Europe, along with the Balkans, to replay our ancient wars. We were but part of a bigger bloody century, and we need to think more robustly, more intellectually, more deeply, and more ethically about the long 20th century if we are to remember the future and not descend again into the morass of killing and fear and militarised nationalism. By thinking deeply about the 20th century past, it may teach us that old answers don't work and won't work now. That will be quite a learning in itself. But in Judd's words, what the past can truly help us understand is the perennial complexity of the questions. So we remember the past. We remember the future. And on the way, we embrace the complexity of the question.